So, hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I am joined by Michael Galant, Senior Research and Outreach Associate with the international team at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. At CEPR, Michael conducts research and policy analysis on the IMF's special drawing rights and surcharge policies, as well as economic sanctions. And it is precisely this, economic sanctions, what we will be discussing today. Welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to start, could you tell us about the work that you do at CEPR? I'm very interested in, the Sanctions Watch. We've been following it from Security in Context, and we really enjoy what you write. So, could you discuss, how and why CEPR chose to focus on this topic, the topic of economic sanctions, and what are some of the recurring themes covered in this monthly analysis of sanctions that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for having me, and thank you especially for plugging the Sanctions Watch so I didn't have to force it. So, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, we're a DC based think tank founded by heterodox economists in 1999, with the goal of using economic tools and analysis to help to inform broader movements for a more just, equitable economy in the US and globally. We do a lot of different work, but as you point out, lately we have done some extensive documentation of the human consequences of economic sanctions. So, as your listeners will know, economic sanctions, restrictions on trade and finance, they have exploded in use in recent years. Um, they are often broad, unilateral, and indiscriminately imposed, with devastating consequences for entire economies, populations, and millions of people. Now, the US public is not particularly well informed about this. I don't think they have a good sense of just how destructive, illegal, and immoral these economic sanctions are. And so, our goal with the Sanctions Watch is to build that information a little bit more. So every month it is we round up the news and analysis of U.S. sanctions policy, summarizing sort of country by country news and updates from Afghanistan, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, bringing all of this together to get the bigger picture on U.S. sanctions policy beyond just little headlines from one particular context or another. This is useful for policymakers, for activists, for experts, and for the general public alike. Any given month, you might see, a UN expert talking about how sanctions hinder humanitarian activity in Afghanistan. You might find news from the Hill, legislative activities, the Republicans' latest efforts to tighten the noose a little bit on Syria or on Iran. And you might find analysis from experts and activists that are opposed to these sanctions from civil society. If there are any themes to speak of, I think it becomes pretty evident reading these month after month that the short story is essentially economic sanctions cause mass impoverishment, starvation, and often death. The world is largely opposed to these economic sanctions, particularly in the global south, where they are seen as an example of the US flouting international law in order to project its own narrow interests. And despite this, sanctions have become a real go-to tool for US policymakers. There are new sanctions imposed every month, every week, every couple of days. And so part of the project of the Sanctions Watch and our work at CEPR is to highlight just how harmful these sanctions are so that people across the US might understand that and might mobilize to end this really destructive practice. And I should add, you can subscribe to the Sanctions Watch at CEPR.net, CEPR.net.
I was going to say that at the end of the interview, but it's always good to repeat it a couple times. So could you share with us some of the main trends that you've observed about the scope and extent of U.S. sanctions, in your work at CEPR? And we're very interested in like how the United States has used or is using sanctions, and how this use of sanctions has evolved over the past years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the biggest trend is just in sheer terms of quantity. Since the 1980s, the number of sanctions that the US has in place have quadrupled. It's a really massive increase. In terms of number of countries that are affected by sanctions in some form or another, in the 60s, there were 4% of all countries were affected by sanctions. Today, it is 1 in 4 countries that are under sanctions in some form. So really, I mean, quantity is one of the big stories. That's not to say that sanctions were not used or were not a problem in the past. Clearly, the embargo of Cuba is over 60 years old. The sanctions on North Korea run back decades. But it really is a massive development that so many policymakers just see this as the very first tool in their toolbox to slap on sanctions whenever they can. Part of the reason for that is that they're just seen as not having political costs in the same way as traditional types of intervention. And if I can paraphrase Joy Gordon, who is a sanctions academic and expert who joined us at a CEPR event recently, she said that when a bomb is dropped, you see the crater and you see the human carnage. Sanctions can be just as deadly, but it's harder to point to that connection, and it doesn't make the same headlines. And that's sort of what our work has been at CEPR, is really trying to highlight these massive human consequences. I believe you all have actually interviewed CEPR Senior Research Fellow Francisco Rodriguez, who recently did a report reviewing the econometric literature on the human consequences of sanctions and found a near total academic consensus that sanctions harm civilians. That's pretty intuitive. I don't think you should have to have all that econometric evidence to prove it, but really, sanctions hinder economic growth. They obstruct access to essential goods like food, energy, medicine. They hinder humanitarian access. They increase rates of poverty, disease, mortality. I mean, this is all the economic terminology. In short, people starve, people die from lack of access to medicines that exist. Sanctions kill. Now, and I should add that that's disproportionately, marginalized communities, the poor, especially women and minorities, as with many economic hardships, are affected the most. Now, besides quantity, the sort of more recent developments in sanctions, under the Trump administration, sanctions were wielded with really terrible effect. They imposed the 2017 and 2019 oil and financial sanctions on Venezuela. They reneged on the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed the sanctions that had been lifted as a part of that. And they reversed what small but meaningful progress had been made on Cuba under the Obama administration. But it would be a mistake to think that this is a sort of partisan issue or a Republican problem. Many of these wide sanctions regimes absolutely preceded Trump. And the Biden administration has had ample opportunity to reverse Trump era policy, and he often has simply not done so, and then has imposed new sanctions of his own. I mean, Russia, of course, but then also the effective sanctions of freezing $7 billion of Afghanistan central bank assets at a time of mass starvation in that country. The Biden administration has played around at the edges a little bit. They've talked more talk about narrowly targeting their sanctions. There is a range of degree of targeting of sanctions, but often a targeted sanction that sort of belies some wider impact. They have also, to some degree, expanded humanitarian exemptions, though what is an exemption for humanitarian goods when your sanctions are causing the humanitarian need in the first place? And they've also hired a few more people on to sort of assess the quote unquote unintended consequences of sanctions. But when it comes to the fact that you are effectively waging economic warfare on countries around the world, affecting millions of people, these developments that are positive are truly marginal. And I'd say that fundamentally little has changed administration to administration.
Yeah, you mentioned Cuba, and I think we should definitely talk about this because last week the UN General Assembly adopted for the 31st time a resolution condemning the embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba, which was first imposed in 1960. So a total of 187 states supported the resolution, and only the U.S. and Israel voted against, and Ukraine abstained. So, what is your assessment of these results?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. and it will be covered in the November Sanctions Watch. As you say, this is 31 times now, over 3 decades. The UN General Assembly has voted nearly unanimously every time to condemn the US embargo of Cuba. By my count, only 9 countries have ever opposed, and that is typically just the US and Israel in most cases, which I think says a lot about those two. Um, so to highlight that, I mean, even other Western countries, typical US allies, France, UK, Germany, cannot help but admit that the US embargo of Cuba is condemnable. I mean, this is over 60 years of the unilateral and illegal suffocation of a nation and people. Now, while votes like this are not binding, and clearly in 30 years it hasn't changed US policy, I think it's important because it demonstrates the limits to international buy in to US hegemony. Um, how many times have we heard US leaders refer to a consensus in the international community around a particular policy, only to learn that the international community that they're referring to is just the US and its allies in the global north? But this is a case where there truly is international consensus, repeated time and time again, but it is opposed to a US policy, and so the US simply ignores it. This is also, I think, a good demonstration of what the US means by the rules-based international order. You hear that a lot. Uh, and why it is so easy for countries across the global south to see right through that claim. I mean, it's worth remembering that in most cases, US unilateral sanctions are likely illegal. There's a whole school of legal thought that finds that only the UN is legally allowed to impose sanctions, which would make all unilateral sanctions illegal. The US is also party to a number of treaties that more or less explicitly forbid unilateral coercive measures against other parties, such as the OAS Charter, which the US is violating by sanctioning Venezuela. And the US is also party to a number of international human rights and war crimes treaty. I mean, the Hague and Geneva Conventions explicitly forbid collective punishment, and that's effectively what sanctions are, collective punishment. Now, the trick is that the Geneva Conventions only apply in wartime, but if something is so heinous that it should be illegal when you're literally at war with another country, then it should probably be illegal when you are ostensibly at peace. That's a bit of a digression on the legality, but it's just to point to the fact that this regular vote is sort of the so-called rules-based international order in miniature, which is the US and Israel hand in hand for the suffocation of the Cuban people.
So, this is a broader question about US foreign policy and use of sanctions. How do you explain the United States sanctions policy within the broader scope of its foreign policy, particularly with the increasing use of secondary sanctions as well as sanctions against China? Um, I have a few follow up questions. I'll just say it all now. So, are US, in your opinion, are US sanctions simply a tool of US hegemony? Or are there examples of sanctions that have brought about positive change? Because there's a lot of controversy about this. And I know that, I think CEPR has a position that you've already mentioned on this, but let's also consider, I guess, the other side of the debate, right? Could sanctions be a less destructive substitute for those who want to push back against militarism and warfare or not?
Yeah, I mean those are great questions. I think that, as you say, unilateral economic sanctions are essentially a tool for the maintenance of US power and hegemonic interests. There are certainly sanctions that are probably applied foolishly, probably applied because there are just sort of perverse incentives. It's really easy for policymakers to say, I want to look tough on an issue. I'm going to slap sanctions on them, regardless of what the effect is, regardless of whether it achieves even its purported goals. Um, but the fact that so many sanctions regimes have been in place for decades, I think we have to take seriously that there is a sort of, that these are not totally mistakes, right? That they are an expression of what policymakers see to be US interests. And that is, uh, honestly, it is, in many cases, it is regime change. against countries that are seen to be defying U.S. interests. And this is not to defend any particular country's government, but from Cuba to Iran to North Korea to Venezuela to Syria, I mean, the goal of economic sanctions, the calculation is, I mean, the goal is regime change for U.S. interests, and not the interests of U.S. civilians, certainly not the interests of working people or civilians in those countries, but U.S. power and economic interests. The calculation is that these sanctions will impose so much suffering on civilian populations that it will cause them or their elite classes to rise up and depose their leader, which means that this is really integral to sanctions, is that, as the expression goes, the cruelty is the point, right? They are intended to impact civilians. That's a really intense claim, but there are others who have said this. I mean, I'm going to read from a quote. Congressman Jim McGovern, when he was chair of the House Rules Committee, wrote a letter to President Biden asking to lift sanctions on Venezuela, to ease sanctions on Venezuela. And he wrote, "The impact of sectoral and secondary sanctions is indiscriminate and purposely so. Although U.S. officials regularly say that sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign is to increase the economic cost to Venezuela. Economic pain is the means by which the sanctions are supposed to work. It is not the Venezuelan officials who suffer the costs, it is the Venezuelan people." And you can point to all sorts of quotes from the Trump administration just because they were sort of sloppy, where they often admitted that they were intending to harm the Venezuelan people, the Iranian people. So that's sort of the logic of economic sanctions. I think one thing that the Biden administration has seen is that that logic doesn't work so well when you're up against countries with more economic might than a Cuba or Venezuela. The US and EU sanctions against Russia have had massive blowback effects politically and economically, particularly in Europe, to say nothing of the economic repercussions in the global south. And there's also been, as you mentioned, an increased use of sanctions and export controls as a part of the wider Cold War against China. These might hurt China. They're not going to cause the same degree of sort of economic collapse as happened in Venezuela. But what they're doing is accelerating this process of geopolitical fracturing, whereby sanctioned countries, whatever you might think of their governments, are quite understandably coming together in opposition to an international order that they see as where the US gets to make the rules and arbitrarily enforce them. So that's, I think, sort of the geopolitical context. You asked if they can be used as a tool for positive change as an alternative to warfare. First, I would sort of contest that they're necessarily all that less destructive than warfare. Certainly, there's a range of sanction sizes, and some are more targeted than others. But the broadest regimes, I mean, you see effects that are comparable to that of war. Can they be used for good? Can there be just wars? Yes, but I think that if you look at US militarism, the overwhelming lesson is the need to roll back US militarism, and I think it's a pretty similar idea. You might be able to find exceptional cases. We point to apartheid South Africa, but there are so many sort of contingencies in that. It was a global movement with mass support from colonized people who were themselves calling for the sanctions to be imposed on their country. With near unanimous multilateral approval by the United Nations. These were not unilateral, in order to pressure a government that was highly reliant on US political and economic backing in order to help, in some part, to accelerate decolonization efforts. That's a lot of contingencies and exceptions. It's possible that that applies to Israel today. I don't think that these exceptional cases should detract all that much from the overwhelming and dominant trend and lesson, which is that the US is unilaterally and indiscriminately imposing immense suffering, occasionally death, on millions of people around the world for the sake of projecting its own narrow power interests. And that is the heart of US economic sanctions today, and that is what is really incumbent on all of us to oppose.
Glad you mentioned Israel because there are, a few, not a lot, but a few progressive leaders calling for sanctions on Israel, and so yeah, I'm glad that you touched upon that. Um, to conclude, is there anything that you'd like to add, maybe to wrap up the interview?
Uh, besides, subscribing to the Sanctions Watch, I would just say I think it's important that we see these uh, efforts to oppose economic sanctions as not solely single country by country. And there are incredible experts and movements that have been working country by country, and the embargo on Cuba, etc. But I think we have to see these as a much larger trend, as a real integral part of US foreign policy and the functioning of the international system at this time. And it is a key thing that we need to oppose just as much as we would oppose US militarism, even if the effects are less immediately visible.
Michael Gallant, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.